What if the scariest thing about Manbat wasn't the hideous transformation, but the fact that he's still completely human inside? For decades, Kirk Langstrom's story has followed a familiar pattern. A brilliant scientist pushes too far. He tests a serum, turning himself into a monster. Sometimes it's an accident, other times it's intentional. Whether driven by ambition, addiction, or obsession, becoming Manbat has almost always meant losing control and becoming a beast. But beware, the Batman does something very different with that formula. Here, while Langstrom doesn't choose to be transformed, he doesn't stop being himself. He is rational, strategic, and ultimately heroic. That shift might not sound dramatic at first, but when you place this version beside the conflicted scientist of the comics, the addict from Batman the Animated Series, and the power-hungry obsessive of The Batman, it's clear that, for the first time, Manbat is Langstrom's best self. And to understand why that matters, especially when he's forced to make one of the most morally disturbing decisions in the entire series, let's look at every version that came before him. Manbat first appeared in Detective Comics number 400, published in 1970. He was Kirk Langstrom, an ambitious scientist. Originally, his goal was to gain powers to rival Batman because he wanted to be a celebrated hero. Later, retcons changed his motivations to an attempt to cure his own deafness, giving the character a more sympathetic and human dimension. But in those early days, all he cared about was power. The serum he created initially seemed promising: sonar vision, acute hearing, and increased physical capabilities. But the serum began transforming Langstrom into a monstrous man-bat, and over time, the creature's instincts dominated the man. The early stories emphasized the duality at the heart of the character. Langstrom struggled to maintain control over his mind and morality as his feral impulses gained dominance. This conflict extended to those closest to him. Francine, his fiancée, became a victim of his transformation, turning into She-Bat when exposed to the serum. Batman intervened, injecting both with an antidote, temporarily restoring their humanity, but the threat of regression lingered. Despite the horror of this situation, the two married and were mostly happy, which is an unusual development in Batman's rogues gallery. The pair left Gotham and tried to put their bad experiences behind them, but somehow they kept getting dragged back into that life. Eventually they accepted their fate, and as Manbat, Langstrom took a job as a private investigator. This demonstrated that the character was capable of heroism, showing that he could coexist with the knowledge of his own monstrous nature. However, this phase was short-lived. The feral, uncontrollable aspect of Manbat resurfaced, returning him to an antagonistic role, and he has been flip-flopping between that ever since. These stories established his central motif, the struggle between human reasoning and animalistic compulsion, and how it erodes his sense of self. Manbat first appeared on screen in Batman the Animated Series' pilot episode On Leather Wings in 1992. Here, the creative team took a markedly different approach, reframing his story through the lens of addiction. Rather than a scientist seeking to enhance his abilities or cure a disability, Langstrom became an individual consumed by the euphoria of transformation. The Manbat serum functioned as a chemical escape, a way to experience relief from the constant self-awareness and analytical exhaustion that characterized his human life. This interpretation emphasizes the psychological appeal of the transformation. Becoming Manbat offered Langstrom a temporary mental silence from intoxication. In this sense, the character's horror was less about monstrosity and more about the seductive power of addiction. Here, the transformation represents escape from the self, not evolution of it. The series also explored the collateral damage of dependence. Francine's accidental transformation demonstrated the consequences of addiction and how they extend beyond the individual, affecting loved ones and the wider community. Batman treated Langstrom as a figure in need of guidance rather than punishment, highlighting the series' moral emphasis, the possibility of redemption and the human capacity to confront and overcome destructive impulses. Langstrom's narrative in BTAS was not designed for recurring characters though. His story was largely self-contained, serving as an allegory rather than a template for ongoing conflict. The next on-screen adaptation of Manbat completely avoided this nuance and instead returned to Langstrom's original ambition of becoming a creature of the night. 2004's The Batman treated Langstrom's transformation as an obsession. Unlike the comics' conflicted hero or BTAS's addicted genius, the series' Langstrom believed that physical transformation equaled power, which is something he desperately lacked. His short stature, pale skin, and albinistic traits suggested a man accustomed to being overlooked, driving a compulsion to assume a form that would be impossible to ignore. Becoming the Manbat was an act of both self-reinvention and revenge on the invisibility he felt in human society. Langstrom believed his new form would hand him control of the night, whatever that meant, but repeatedly exposed his limitations. Like the BTAS version, this Manbat was bestial and couldn't speak. It took the character's animalistic nature even further by having it drink animal blood and showed a predatory cunning. Yet the power he sought proved unsatisfying. Rather than giving him power over others, he was consistently defeated or enslaved. First Batman beat him, then he fell under Penguin's control, and finally he was imprisoned by Rumour. Despite his strength and intelligence, he became a pawn, reinforcing the idea that ambition without self-knowledge can be self-defeating. Power promised control, but it delivered subjugation. The man who wanted to dominate became dominated. Morally, the Batman's Manbat was more villainous than his predecessors, yet not purely malevolent. He pursued power to assert presence rather than to harm for harm's sake, making him more complex than a standard antagonist. Ultimately, this version of Langstrom abandoned becoming Manbat because it was more trouble than it was worth. Taken together, these three iterations create a spectrum of Manbat characterization. The comic's conflicted scientist, BTAS's addicted and morally constrained man, and the Batman's obsessive power seeker. In contrast, Beware the Batman presents a version who did not choose to become a monster, but is fully sentient and even becomes a reliable ally to Batman. This Kirk Langstrom was a researcher at Gotham Zoo looking into how humanity could leverage the Bat's strong immune system. There's no mention of Francine, and he didn't willingly become Manbat. He was forced into injecting himself with an experimental serum by Professor Pig and Mr. Toad. In this series, Professor Pig was reimagined as a maniacal animal rights activist. Be sure to check out my video about him if you haven't seen it already. I've linked to it in the info button in the top right corner. But Pig was delighted with the transformation. He intended to use the same serum, but with other animal DNA, to create a menagerie of allies. Mr. Toad also planned to use the serum to transform an unsuspecting woman into his bride, which is pretty icky. While his transformation is violent and he smashes through the window, heading off into the night sky, this Manbat is not a beast. Pig and Toad initially treat him as a weapon, fitting him with a mind control device, forcing him to help them with their scheme. But Batman gets involved, knocking Manbat out and taking him back to the Batcave where he can examine him. Once the device is removed, it becomes clear that Langstrom is coherent, intelligent, and inherently heroic. Unlike prior versions, he does not struggle with animalistic instincts or obsessive ambition. Instead, he actively chooses to help others. He helps Batman and Katana save the hostages, even though he ends up back under Pig's control. Ultimately, Batman saves the day and Manbat heads off to research a cure for himself. But that wasn't the end of him in the series. When Deathstroke, the ultimate villain from the second half of the season, revealed himself, Katana had to round up allies to help defeat him. She called on Barbara Gordon, Metamorpho, and Manbat. Deathstroke had strategically placed multiple bombs throughout the Batcave with the intention of destroying it and Wayne Manor. Katana and the team rounded up the bombs and Metamorpho absorbed the explosion. When Batman defeated Deathstroke in a hand-to-hand battle, they were left with a conundrum though. They would not kill him, but he knew Batman's secret identity and threatened to reveal it. Batman accepts that this is the end of his crusade, but Manbat speaks out. What if they could erase his memory? The decision to wipe Deathstroke's mind is one of the most morally complex moments in the series, and it is such a shame that they didn't get to explore the implications further. They can't just remove his knowledge of Batman's secret identity, they have to remove everything. His past, his motivations, his grudges, his personality. In effect, they eliminate the person he was. From a utilitarian perspective, the decision is defensible. Conventional imprisonment would likely fail, and execution would violate Batman's moral code. Memory erasure permanently neutralizes the threat while technically preserving his life. It protects Gotham and avoids directly killing. However, the ethical implications are severe. Personal identity is inseparable from memory. By erasing his mind wholesale, the team effectively destroys Deathstroke. His body remains alive, sure, but the individual ceases to exist. Now, this act could be interpreted as a form of mercy. Deathstroke is portrayed as driven by vengeance and cruelty. Removing his memories arguably frees him from that psychological torment. But mercy typically involves compassion or consent. In this case, the decision is imposed unilaterally. The team assumes the authority to decide that this entire identity can be removed for the greater good, and this is relevant to this video because it is Kirk Langstrom who proposes the solution. Unlike earlier incarnations of Manbat, who were defined by loss of control, addiction, or obsession, this version is fully rational and morally aware. He applies science not to transform himself, but to fundamentally alter another human being. This positions him as intelligent and strategic, but also morally pragmatic. He is willing to cross a line that Batman traditionally hesitates to even approach. The result preserves Batman's no-kill rule in a technical sense while still engaging in an irreversible act. And it forces the audience to consider whether preserving biological life is sufficient to maintain moral integrity. And it is such a shame that this was the final episode of the show and they never got to explore this any further, because it's a really fascinating discussion topic. Regardless, rather than presenting Manbat as tragic or monstrous, Beware the Batman frames him as a character capable of making difficult, morally ambiguous choices in the service of a larger goal. That complexity is what distinguishes this version from those that came before. Where previous versions explored addiction, ambition, and the limits of power, Beware the Batman's Langstrom demonstrates that heroism can coexist with monstrosity, and that ethical choice rather than physical transformation can define the character too. He's recast as a proactive, morally nuanced member of Gotham's vigilante ecosystem, and I don't think it gets enough credit for it. For decades, Manbat has been defined by a loss of control. In the comics, he was consumed by his own experiment. In Batman the Animated Series, he was trapped in addiction. In The Batman, he was devoured by obsession and the illusion of power. Each version treated the transformation as a tragedy, the moment when Kirk Langstrom ceased to fully be himself. But Beware the Batman flips that idea entirely. If anything, becoming Manbat makes Kirk Langstrom. When faced with the ultimate moral dilemma, what to do with Deathstroke, he doesn't shy away from the weight of the decision. Ultimately, what defines this Manbat is not the serum in his veins, it's the choices he makes after it. Okay, that's it for this essay. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, leave a comment, tell all your friends about me. You know how YouTube works. If you really liked the video and feel like tossing a buck or two my way, please consider using the thanks button, because every little helps. And if you have really enjoyed my work, you might want to pick up a copy of my book, Rogues Gallery. It features 22 essays on villains from Batman the Animated Series. There's a beautiful cover by Batman the Animated Series background artist John Calmette, a foreword by director Dan Reber, and a moving segment from the late Kevin Conroy sharing his thoughts on life, love, and loss. Plus, an exclusive essay on the Condiment King that will never be made into a video. Rogues Gallery is available worldwide on Amazon, both digitally and in softcover. Finally, channel memberships are just $1.99 a month and give you early access to my essays, custom emojis, and your name featured on my members end screen, which has been rolling for a little while now. Huge thanks to everyone who's already part of this. You've helped to make these videos possible. If you want to see your name up here too, join the channel now. And while I have your attention, please consider checking out my other channel, Serum Lake Comics, where I talk about mostly DC comic books. Next time. When I return on Monday, it'll be time to talk about the surprise winner of my latest The Batman Villain Poll, the rotund receptacle of all knowledge who could have been the Riddler if he hadn't been rejected by DC, the Clue Master. When I return on Monday, I'm going to go back to a character seen in Static Shock to talk about fan service. I want to talk about Static's best friend, Richie Stone, the hero called Gear. Hope to see you then.